Atlas Shrugged, which was written in, I believe it was 1959, sometime in the 1950s, by Ayn Rand. I think most persons are familiar with Ayn Rand. I was introduced to her as a person very early in my childhood, because I had an aunt who was an avid follower of Ayn Rand at a time where most people didn't know who Ayn Rand was. I think she became a little bit more familiar because Alan Greenspan was a protege of Ayn Rand. So, and I was trying to think as I sat there, not doing my best at paying attention, I apologize, at trying to recall why. I read the book over a period last year. It's even longer, it's over 1,000 pages. And I know we had some discussion in a class I teach at Lawrence Tech, but it's very familiar with the Fountainhead, which is supposedly based on the life of Frank Lloyd Wright and his character. But anyway, I picked up a copy here at the library, had it for the 2 or 3 weeks, and didn't get very far, so I bought my own copy. And I've selected a few passages towards the end of the book. The gist of the book is that in a period not unlike we have now of economic and somewhat social turmoil, there is various things being tried by the government to correct the situation, and a significant part of society, the industrialists, begin to disappear from society. And this is all because of the actions of one person, who I don't really consider the main character, John Galt, but is the name that is associated with the book. And he is convincing these people to leave, these industrialists to leave society because of, frankly, the poor treatment they're receiving and the desire to redistribute the gains of their activities to society in general. So these people are disappearing over the book. And running concurrently to this is kind of the saga of Taggart Continental Railroad, which is run by James Taggart and his sister Dagny, who I consider to be the main character of the book. And Jim is the president of the company because he's the son, and he's kind of a reluctant president, and one who tries to take perhaps the path of least resistance with government and other burdens. And Dagny, that may be part of the reason the book was controversial, was really, for lack of a better term, a feminist type character in the 50s. She was an engineer, and she really ran as vice president the railroad. And as these people are removed from society, Dagny works very hard to keep the railroad running. But eventually, through the plot of the book, she discovers this community where John Galt has brought all of the industrialists, and chooses not to stay but to come back to society. And the first passage I'm going to read is when she has returned to Taggart Railroads because they are having problems with accidents on the railway. And she's kind of being reintroduced to the problems. The passage will, the characters are brother James, an old friend, childhood friend who's part of an assistant running the railroad named Eddie Willers, and a government bureaucrat named Cuffy Meigs, who is, in her absence, been involved with the running of the railroad. So she's come back, and she's at a meeting with the three individuals, and they're discussing some of the issues of the problems with the railroad. She remained silent. She sat looking at their faces. There was still an element of wonder in the numbed indifference of her mind. Jim had always managed to switch the weight of his failures upon the strongest plants around him and to survive by destroying them to pay for his heirs, as he had done with Dan Conway, as he had done with the industries of Colorado. But this did not have even the rationality of a looter. This pouncing upon the drained carcass of a weaker, a half-bankrupt competitor for a moment's delay with nothing but a cracking bone between the pouncer and the abyss. The impulse of the habit of reason almost pushed her to speak, to argue, to demonstrate the self-evident, but she looked at their faces and she saw they knew it. In some terms different from hers, in some inconceivable manner of consciousness, they knew all that she could tell them. It was useless to prove to them the irrational horror of their course and of its consequences. Both Meigs and Taggart knew it, and the secret of their consciousness was the means by which they escaped the finality of their knowledge. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, what would you rather have had me do?" screamed Taggart. "Give up our transcontinental traffic, go bankrupt, turn the railroad into a miserable East Coast local?" Her two words seemed to have hit him worse than any indignant objection. He seemed to be shaking with terror at that which the quiet "I see" had acknowledged, seeing I couldn't help it. We had to have a transcontinental track. There was no way to get around the tunnel. We had no money to pay for any extra costs. Something had to be done. We had to have a track. Meigs was looking at him with a glance of part astonishment, part disgust. "I'm not arguing, Jim," she said dryly. "We couldn't permit a railroad like Taggart Transcontinental to crash. It would have been a national catastrophe. We had to think of all the cities and industries and shippers and passengers and employees and stockholders whose lives depend on us. It wasn't just for ourselves, it was for the public welfare. Everybody agrees that railroad unification plan is practical, the best informed." "Jim," she said, "if you have any further business to discuss with me, discuss it." "You've never considered the social angle of anything," he said in a sullen, retreating voice. She noticed that this form of pretense was as unreal to Mr. Meigs as it was to her, though for an antipodal reason. She was looking at Jim with bored contempt. Jim appeared to her suddenly as a man who had tried to find a middle course between two poles, Meigs and herself, and who was now seeing that his course was narrowing and that he was to be ground between two straight walls. "Mr. Meigs," she asked, prompted by a touch of bitterly amused curiosity, "what is your economic plan for day after tomorrow?" She saw his bleary brown eyes focus upon her without expression. "You're impractical," he said. "It's perfectly useless to theorize about the future," snapped Taggart, "when we have to take care of the emergency of the moment, in the long run." "In the long run, we'll all be dead," said Meigs. Then abruptly he shot to his feet. "I'll run along, Jim," he said. "I've got no time to waste on conversations." He added, "You talk to her about that matter of doing something to stop all those train wrecks. If she's the little girl who's such a wizard at railroading," it was said inoffensively, he was a man who would not know when he was giving offense or taking it. "I'll see you later, Cuffy," said Taggart, as Meigs walked out with no parting glance at any of them. Taggart looked at her expectantly and fearfully, as if dreading her comment, yet desperately hoping to hear some word, any word. "Well," she asked, "what do you mean? Have you anything else to discuss?" "Well, he sounded disappointed. "Yes," he cried in the tone of a desperate plunge, "I have another matter to discuss, the most important one of all." Your growing number of train wrecks?" "No, not that." "What then?" "It's that you're going to appear on Bertram Scudder's radio program tonight." Bertram Scudder was let's, for lack of a better term, pseudo-intellectual who theorized on some of the reasons for the social situation. She leaned back. "Am I?" "Dagny, it's imperative. It's crucial. There's nothing to be done about it. To refuse is out of the question. In times like these, one has no choice." And she glanced at her watch. "I'll give you 3 minutes to explain, if you want to be heard at all, and you'd better speak straight." "All right," he said desperately. "It's considered most important on the highest levels. I mean Chick Morrison and Wesley Mooch and Mr. Thompson, as high as that, that you should make a speech to the nation, a morale-building speech, saying that you haven't quit." "Why?" "Because everyone thought that you had. You don't know what's been going on lately, but it's sort of uncanny. The country is full of rumors, all sorts of rumors about everything, all of them dangerous, disruptive, I mean. People seem to do nothing but whisper. They don't believe the newspapers, they don't believe the best speakers, they believe every vicious, scaremongering piece of gossip that comes floating around. There's no confidence left, no faith, no order, no respect for authority. People seem to be on the verge of panic. Well, for one thing, it's the damnable business of all those big industrialists who vanished into thin air. Nobody's been able to explain it, and it's giving them the jitters. There's all sorts of hysterical stuff being whispered about it. But what they whisper mostly is that no decent man will work for these people. They mean the people in Washington. Now do you see? You wouldn't suspect that you were so famous, but you are, or you've become ever since your plane crashed. Nobody believed that the plane crashed. They all thought that you had broken the law. That is Directive 10-289 and deserted. Directive 10-289 is a law that has been passed that basically freezes all wages, all consumption. You must consume no more, no less than what you've consumed the year before. You cannot produce any more, any less. Very similar parallels are drawn to the wage and price controls of the Nixon era. They all thought you had broken the law, that is Directive 10-289, and deserted. There's a lot of popular misunderstanding of Directive 10-289, and a lot of unrest. Now you see how important it is that you go on the air and tell people that it isn't true that Directive 10-289 is destroying industry, that it's a sound piece of legislation devised for everybody's good, and that if they'll just be patient a little longer, things will improve and prosperity will return. They don't believe any public official anymore. You're an industrialist, one of the few left of the old school, and the only one who's ever come back after they thought you'd gone. You're known as a reactionary who's opposed to Washington policies, so the people will believe you. It would have a great influence on them. It would buttress their confidence. It would help their morale. Now do you see? He had rushed on, encouraged by the odd look of her face, a look of contemplation that was almost a faint half-smile. She had listened, hearing his words, the sound of Reardon's voice. Reardon's another character in the book, another industrialist, saying to her on a spring evening over a year ago, "They need some sort of sanction from us. I don't know the nature of that sanction, but Dagny, I know that if we value our lives, we must not give it to them. If they put you on a torture rack, don't give it to them. Let them destroy your railroad and my mills, but don't give it to them. Now do you see?" "Oh yes, Jim, I see." He could not interpret the sound of her voice. It was low, it was part moan, part chuckle, part triumph, but it was the first sound of emotion to come from her. And he plunged on with no choice but to hope. "I promised them in Washington that you'd speak. We can't fail them, not in an issue of this kind. We can't afford to be suspected of disloyalty. It's all arranged. You'll be the guest speaker on Bertram Scudder's program tonight at 10:30. He's got a radio program where he interviews prominent public figures. It's a national hookup. He has a large following. He reaches over 20 million people. The office of the morale conditioner has..." "The what?" "The morale conditioner. That's Chick Morrison. Has called me 3 times to make sure that nothing would go wrong. They've issued orders to all of the news broadcasters. We've been announcing it all day, all over the country, telling them to listen to you tonight on Bertram Scudder's hour." He looked at her as if he were demanding both an answer and the recognition that her answer was the element of least importance in these circumstances. She said, "You know what I think of the Washington policies and of Directive 10-289. At a time like this, we can't afford the luxury of thinking." She laughed aloud. "But don't you see that you can't refuse them now," he yelled. "If you don't appear after all these announcements, it will support the rumors. It will amount to an open declaration of disloyalty. The trap won't work, Jim." "What trap?" "The one you're always setting up." "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You knew it, that I would refuse, so you pushed me into a public trap where my refusal would become an embarrassing scandal for you, more embarrassing than you thought I'd dare to cause. You were counting on me to save your faces, and the next you stuck out. I won't save them. But I promised it." "I didn't. But we can't refuse them. Don't you see that they've got us hogtied?